Again, welcome and thank you for joining us for this great webinar. Data in the North Central region, the Nebraska Rural Poll, the Ohio Farm Poll, and the NCR-Stat. Of course, these are not the only rural polls being conducted in the North Central region. Iowa also does a poll, has been doing it for many years, and so have others. But these are just examples of data sources and the types of things that are going on across the region that we try to lift up. Our three speakers are L.J. McElravy, Associate Professor in the Department of Agricultural Leadership, Education and Communication and Rural Prosperity, Nebraska, University of Nebraska at Lincoln. He is a leadership scholar and has been a member of the Rural Poll team since 2015. His primary research focuses on leadership development through the lifespan. Our second speaker, Douglas Jackson Smith, Professor, Kellogg Chair, and Director of the Agro-Ecosystem Management Program, The Ohio State University. Dr. Jackson Smith is a rural sociologist whose work explores the human dimensions of complex ecosystems and working landscapes. He brings multi-method social science to interdisciplinary teams studying rural and agricultural change. Dr. Susanna Bednarek, Research and Extension Specialist, North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. Susanna conducts applied research in the broad area of rural social and economic development. Her research focuses on socioeconomic geography, rural demography, and regional data availability and needs. And she is our NCR-Stat guru for most of the data that we collect as well. And just as a heads up, our next webinar will be on caregiving across the life's course in rural and urban households in the North Central region. And that will go and take you through all of the different data that is available on the new data set, the NCR-Stat Caregiving Survey, which is now available for download, but you'll get much more information next month when we do the webinar, and hopefully by then we might even have the Northeast available for you. And with that, I'll hand it over to our speakers. LJ, sorry, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Well, welcome everyone. Good to see so many folks joining us this morning. Let me make sure I'm changing my slide. All right, so I have the pleasure of talking to you a little bit about the Nebraska Rural Poll. So the rumor is that the Nebraska Rural Poll is the longest yearly poll surveying rural folks in the U.S. That's the rumor. I like to say that because I don't know that's true, but we feel like that's true, and we talk about it as though it's true. But if anyone has any information different from that, we'd love to know. But we've been polling rural Nebraskans for 28 years. The Rural Poll team down here, it's a mixture of folks within my department, Agricultural Leadership, Education, Communication, and the Ag Economics Department here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. We also have folks who participate from our extension as well. So the goal of the Nebraska Rural Poll is to give local and state leaders a better understanding of the issues, challenges, and concerns of Nebraska's rural citizens. And so we've had a number of different funding structures over the course of these 28 years. Right now, the funding is currently provided by Nebraska Extension and Rural Prosperity Nebraska. And so that's we're excited to continue to have the support to be able to offer the Rural Poll, which is often risen up within our institute as an important component of how we engage our stakeholders. So each year, the Rural Poll team comes together and we come up with topics. And so we have a core set of topics that typically don't change much, and that they're focused on community, individual well-being, and then we also ask about individual household and work demographics. And then we have rotating topics. And so these will shift depending on what's happening within Nebraska, what's happening across the globe, really. So we shift these topics. Sometimes we will revisit them as well as time comes up. But as an example, here are some of the things that have come up over some of the questions, the rotating topics that have come up. So community resilience, when we had a lot of natural disasters across the state in 2019 and early 2020, talking a little bit about how does the community bounce back from those kinds of events. And so we've also asked about the impact of the pandemic in 2021. So what I like about the structure is that we have some core topics, which is about half of our survey that we get to track long-term. And then we also have rotating topics that allow us to hone in on specific components that may be relevant on a year-by-year basis. So I see your question, Tamara. And so I don't know if we find any, I've never looked at the relationship between what the rotating topics are and people's engagement with the rural poll. As you can imagine, through that 28-year time span, we have seen a lower response rate over that time, which I think is kind of pretty much typical of surveys. So that's something that we're wrestling with. But I've never looked at the specific topics to know whether or not that influences how people the degree to which people respond. It's an interesting question, though. Well, the way our survey works is that we send out the surveys by mail to 7,000 randomly selected households in 86 counties, and I'll show you what that looks like. So last year, our response rate was a little lower than we normally have, which was 18%. And so you can see our method of mailing out and notifications. So the way we split up the state and what we consider rural in Nebraska, I think since 2013 is best defined as the counties outside of the Lincoln and Omaha metro areas. Even though in 2013, so like a decision had to be made in 2013 about Grand Island, because it's in the middle of the state. Grand Island became a metro area once it passed the 60,000 person threshold. And so the decision at that time was to continue to survey that group while at the same time looking at the northeast part of the state in the Sioux City metro area. And when we think about our state and looking at how those two counties compare to Lincoln and Omaha, or the degree to which they compare to the rest of the state, they're much more like the rest of rural Nebraska in comparison. So really, when we think about defining rural in Nebraska, for the purpose of our poll, it's everything outside of the Lincoln and Omaha metro areas. So I obviously can't go through all of the data that we've collected, but I wanted to go through just maybe some of the highlights from the rural poll over the last couple of years of data we've collected, and give you some examples of what that looks like. So one of the trends that we're seeing right now is the question that we ask is, compared to 5 years ago, are you worse off, about the same, or better off? And so during this time span, we've seen kind of a widening gap between people who feel like they're worse off and better off, with more people feeling like they're better off and fewer people feeling like they're worse off. The last couple of years have seen a shift to change that to where we're seeing less of a gap between people feeling they're worse off and better off. And if we look at this last year was almost at the all-time high of we had 27% of the respondents saying they are worse off today than compared to 5 years ago. The previous two highs were at 28%, which was in the margin of error, and that was in 2009 and 2003. And if you think about when this poll was launched in March of 2003 and 2009, if you want to, I have some hypotheses as to why we might see some differences, but if you have any thoughts on what might have been happening in 2009 and 2003 that might influence why people might feel like they're worse off than they were 5 years ago, go ahead and throw that in the chat. I'd love to see what ideas you come up with. But we're seeing that now, and I think obviously some of that initially in 2001 and the growth in 2002 thought was related to the pandemic, but also the economic instability that people are feeling right now also seems to be connected to this. Yeah, the 2008 financial crisis is one of the ones that I came up with for 2009 because we think about the Great Recession during that time span. Yeah, the economic crisis. 2003, I sometimes wonder whether the Iraq War would have been something that would have been on people's mind, because it would have been the launching of that war would have potentially influenced that. Floods, yeah, good point as well. So yeah, these are obviously we can't hone in on this, but it's nice to be able to have the data to track over time how people are feeling about their well-being today compared to 5 years ago. We also ask about well-being, but we ask them to consider, compared to today, how do you think you'll be 10 years from now? And so more of a future orientation. So the past, looking at the past well-being might be an indicator of how people are feeling today in comparison. But then this question is really, how hopeful are they? And so again, we see the gap shrinking between worse off and better off, where people are feeling less better off or feel like they will be less better off, and people feeling like they will be more worse off in the future. So I think, again, we're seeing some concerns, the optimism about how people are feeling and what the future will hold for them in the rural respondents across Nebraska. So then we've also had the opportunity to ask some questions at various intervals of time. One of the ones that I find most interesting, and maybe I'm biased because I work in education, in higher education, is in 2015 we asked questions about people's opinions, specifically about education and college degrees, and then in 2019 we repeated those questions, and so when we looked at the difference, we saw major changes in that 4-year period, which is a pretty intense change in opinion. So when we think about increasing the number of people who get college degrees to build a strong economy, 53% of the people felt that they agreed or strongly agreed with that statement in 2015, and that decreased to 33%. And then in 2015, we also asked, getting a college education today is more important than it was 10 years ago. And so now we're seeing, or in 2019, we saw a decrease to 44%. Rick, good question. Did we correlate with better off with age? I know we did, but I don't remember what that would have looked like. And so we would want to look at that in the report. We could look that up in the report, or I can send a link and answer that in the chat.
Session
and then in order to get ahead in life these days, it's necessary for a person to get a college education. So we saw 65% agree or strongly agree to then 38%. And so these were, as you might imagine, when we released this report, the university administrators took note of these. And so we ended up having a couple of conversations with the university communications team to kind of talk through these results. Because I think I remember at that time also having the opportunity to share with the admissions groups across campus as well, because they were interested in figuring out what does this mean for recruitment across the state. And so in the last couple of years, we've asked about economic expectations. And so, one of the things that we saw in 2022, in general, people felt like many elements of the economy were going to get much worse, specifically inflation, gas prices, and healthcare costs. And we saw that actually decrease in 2023. And so there was still quite a bit of concern, or at least people thought that the economy wasn't going to get better and was going to get, in general, was going to get worse. People did feel pretty secure overall in their jobs. But then again, that looking at across different groups, you would see differences there as well. So one of the things in 2017 and 2021, we asked about confidence in institutions. And so we saw an increase in public safety agencies and communities. So that increased between 2017 and 2021. And then something that's pretty typical is looking at the presidency and the executive branch. And when you think about the electorate in rural Nebraska and who was in office, we see that influencing, just how much confidence folks have in that branch of government. Something that happened in 2021 was we had funding to conduct a poll, a rural and a metro poll. And so we got funding from Nebraska Business Development Center at the University of Nebraska Omaha to conduct a metro poll. And this was the year that we talked about, or that we were able to ask questions about trust in organizations, specifically around getting reliable information on COVID-19. And so overall, we saw that our rural respondents were less likely to have a lot of trust in many of these different institutions or providers, and the metro respondents having more trust. And then we saw kind of really drastic differences. All the green arrows indicate significant differences, but we see major differences in the CDC, World Health Organization, as a couple of examples. And one of the things is we've talked about this and think about trust in organizations, thinking about how do organizations develop trust so that they the next time there's an emergency that they can be relied upon, or that there'll be confidence in them so that they can be relied upon by our rural Nebraska citizens to help navigate these challenges. And so I'll just share a couple of quick subgroup comparisons, just as examples of some interesting data. Expectations of healthcare costs in 2023. So we see a pretty significant difference based on population size. And so folks who are, I guess, to be clear, everyone thinks it's going to get worse, but the healthcare costs will, for those communities that have more than 10,000 people, are expected to get less worse, or fewer people think they're going to get worse. And that N52, I think, is, I don't think that's accurate. I think it's got cut off by my image there. And then this is to the question about personal financial situation based on education level. So we see, we asked this in 2023 and 2022, but the 2023 results show that folks with higher degrees of education or higher levels of education have more confidence or feel better about their personal financial situation compared to those with lower levels of education. And so thinking about the connection between how stable someone feels their financial situation is in comparison to their education level and seeing those differences. So a couple of things that we've got coming up in the rural poll that I'm excited about, and I think many of the folks on our team are, is we're working right now with the CARES folks at the University of Missouri as we implement All Things Nebraska. And so we're working to get the rural poll into All Things Nebraska so that there's an open access way to map our findings to kind of make this information available to all of our local stakeholders and decision makers. We're always looking for grant funding opportunities, and so we're working on that internally ourselves. But if there are ever opportunities to collaborate on grant funding, please know that we are very interested in that. Some of the things that we're trying as well is we're working to find collaborations for purchasing survey space. And so there's some models like that on our campus already for people purchasing a page or half a page or a set of questions and being able to use that data. We're working on developing a robust communication plan, both internally and externally, to make sure that we're communicating with our stakeholders, communicating with our internal audiences within the universities and researchers. And then one of the things that we're doing for the first time this spring, I'm co-teaching a class with Dr. Heather Aiken in our department on a new class on using on data analysis, but we're using rural poll data to conduct the research. And so the hope is that all the students in that class will be able to have a manuscript in draft, and as well as some public pieces that they'll be able to use and share for non-academic audiences as well at the end of the semester. So that's all I had. So if we have time, I know we're probably a little short on time, so if we can't get to this, I understand. But if you have any questions or thoughts about topics for 2019, please feel free to ask or shoot in the text, and I'd be happy to answer those.
Great, thanks, LJ. I know Doug is coming up next, but he actually had a question in the chat. So while we're switching slides, his question was if you could remind us the percentage of the Nebraska population that lives in the counties included in your rural sample.
That is a great question. I know our rural population is greater than the national average. I think we're around 65%, but sorry, not 65%. 65% is metro. So 35% is rural.
Okay, Doug, do you want to go ahead and share your slides? And then...
Good.
We'll go ahead and get Doug, or maybe LJ, you can answer some of these questions in the chat as they're going along.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me all right? Excellent. Well, I appreciate the chance to talk today. It's great hearing from LJ. I know, if you recall, we did try to touch base back when we were trying to design this poll. And a lot of the work I'm talking about is shaped by experiences of colleagues I have around the country that have been involved, as I have, in either farm or rural population survey work. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the Ohio Farm Poll, which we deployed for the first time using scarce resources back in 2000, I'm sure on the right thing here, 2020. And it was motivated really by a convergence of myself arriving at Ohio State, a colleague, Shoshana Inwood, arriving here, us talking for a couple of years about the desire to spin up a good data source about statewide insights into the farm population. But then the critical issue was this very wet year we had in 2019 in Ohio. It was the wettest 12 months in history. On top of ongoing stress and discussions around trade wars, it led to great concern about mental health and suicides in the state and the region. I think all of you experienced this at that time, and there were really no good single sources of information about the nature of well-being and the nature of stress and how that differs. So we set out to put a survey in the field to look at what was going on in the spring of 2020, coming off the heels of a couple of difficult years. The goals being really to identify drivers of stress. And I don't have a slide on it, but being a sociologist with training in economics, I've always struggled and been excited about balancing the view of farms as businesses and the view of farms as households. And Shoshana Inwood, if you know anything about her work and come to the webinar next month, really focuses on how the household can drive your well-being as much as, if not more than, farms. And so we designed this whole instrument to bring them together in a single survey and tease them apart. So the survey went through a bunch of cycles to get input and design, but focuses on documenting what people experienced in 2019, what their stressors were, what their well-being indicators are, a lot of background metrics about the farm operation and the household. And then we did include some information about attitudes on key issues along the lines of what you heard from LJ. I'm not going to talk about those today. And some baseline data. I do a lot of work on conservation behavior in agriculture, so we didn't have good statewide data, and I wanted to get benchmarks. We implemented the survey in the spring. We put it in the field right away. We wanted to be in January. It was like the 1st of February, and it ran through May. We got the preponderance of our returns back by mid-March, which is important because if you remember mid-March of 2020, that's when the world fell apart. And we didn't anticipate there was going to be a pandemic. But the lion's share of the data we have were in some ways collected right before the pandemic was on our radar. We took some time to actually solicit feedback on the pandemic in the later mailings, and we got a little bit of information, but I see this as really baseline or pre-pandemic for the most part. We sent the sample out to 2,500 randomly selected farm operators. We did stratify by size because larger farms are a lot less numerous. And we wanted to just kind of do evaluations of how they're experiencing things versus small farms. We also had some interest in the organic industry and sampled 500 certified organic farms. Used a mail survey. We had an online option. It was an advance letter, and then 3 mailings of surveys with reminder postcards. Which is a standard thing I've done throughout my career. We got a response rate of 44%. The statewide survey was just under that. The organic farmers were more likely to reply. If you've used these sampling frames, they're problematic. The USDA organic one's great, but the Farm Market ID, or DTN, they're called now, has an awful lot of operations that aren't good. And so coming up with creative ways to get samples is something we can talk about. We did weight the data to approximate the profile of the state that we know from the Census of Agriculture. And these are kind of distributions that are typical for the state of Ohio. And I'm not going to spend much time on the substance, just kind of give you a feel for what we could do with these kinds of data. And like I said, we were setting out to see how stressful things were. And one key question was, how were business conditions last year compared to normal? And most farmers were experiencing worse than average conditions, although it's interesting to know that there's a handful even then that were doing better than usual or hadn't really seen change. When we looked at sources of stress, the weather really jumps out as a major source of stress. And what's interesting that we've talked a bit about in our publications is that the economic issues like costs of farmland and market prices for products, the cost of inputs, are all basically at the same level as healthcare costs. And so as a source of stress, things that people report as major sources of stress, the household issue of healthcare costs and trying to keep health insurance certainly rises to the level of some more traditional farm business questions. We then can use these data, because it's a representative sample, to really break things down by farm type, farm size. I can show you a number of things. And it highlights the heterogeneity that's out there. I mean, a single number for rural Nebraska or for Ohio farmers is an interesting data point to track. But very often, the real interesting story is the variability. And so when you look at the concern about market prices, it was largely a cash grain and a dairy farm issue. When you look at healthcare costs, it was largely 3 kinds of farms: cash grain, hay farmers, and other livestock farmers like beef operations. We did document how common it was to experience delayed planting or significant drop in prices or yields in 2019. And also the presence of some household things like a major health crisis. And we found that these experiences are pretty widespread in the industry. But that was interesting in some ways, they're more common on larger operations. And so when we break it down by farm sales class, the largest operations were more likely to experience these management or production issues, drop impacts on yield, or price impact, with the price effect actually not as present on very large farms in Ohio back in 2019. Now, because I want to talk about the other survey we did, that's it I'm going to give you for 2020. It's just a very small slice of a lot of information that we've collected. But the motivation, because we got out there in early 2020, we talked throughout the pandemic about the desire to go back and see how people are and how they survived and what the impact of the pandemic was. And so we finally got it together last spring to redo the Ohio Farm Poll and focused on a panel study. So we went back only to respondents to that original 2020 survey. It wasn't a new random sample or a overlapping panel and random sample. And the value of panel data in my career is that we ask a lot of questions about cause and effect, or about people in this condition leading to these kinds of outcomes. But cross-sectional data is not a good way to really nail the answers to those questions. In particular, if you're interested in the viability or longevity of certain kinds of farm operations and the exit rates. So we did send this out again in the spring. We used a very similar kind of methodology, although at the very end, we included a letter with a postcard that allowed people to tell us if they were farming or not, as a cleanup thing at the end, and that helped get us some additional information about viability and survival. We got about a 75% overall response rate, including the postcards. It's about 2/3 of them filled out a survey. And we used the results to get a sense of the scale and the rate of exit in Ohio for that original population, and how many of them are still farming in 2023. And we come up with an estimate, I think it's a very conservative estimate, of about 15% of the farm operations we surveyed in the spring of 2020 were still in farming in the spring of 2023. What I can do with these data, and I'm just going to scratch a couple of examples, is look at whether, say, larger farms were more or less likely to exit. And when we look at acres and gross farm income, we see that in general, the largest farms are the least likely to leave the industry. And it's that small, medium size operation with enough land and income to be a significant amount of work that were the most vulnerable to exit. And it was kind of interesting in part because the pandemic narrative was framed in a lot of circles around it exposing the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities of industrial and large-scale agriculture and food systems. Yet 3 years after the pandemic began, we see that the pattern of exit and the pattern of winnowing and sifting is actually very similar to the patterns that we've seen for the last 30 to 50 years in the US. I looked at the exit rates, say, by marketing approach, and we did see that farms that sell direct or farms that sell into organic markets were less likely to exit. When you look at it by age, you see a pattern that research has shown quite a bit before, that early career folks and young farmers are likely to exit because they're very vulnerable. But most exit tends to occur at the end of the life cycle. And so exit tends to be best predicted by the age of the operator. And then we found that households that were wealthier were less likely to get out of agriculture and had more resilience, more ability to lean, and perhaps on other sources of income. I did tie those shock, like, did someone die? Did someone have a health crisis? Did you have a yield drop, or were you impacted by rain and have to delay planting? And whether or not they ended up exiting on the ensuing 3 years. And what we found is very few of the farm shocks, like weather-related issues or market-related issues, were systematically and dramatically related to the likelihood of exit. But many of the household shocks appeared to be more significant predictors of the lack of viability. Things like retiring, getting divorced, or having a major health crisis. Just a really quick highlight of comparing responses. Now, because it's a panel data set, we had this organic and statewide random sample. I'm just going to show you the matched people who replied in both 2020 and 23 from the statewide random sample, and look at a couple of well-being indicators. Now, I talked about the frequency of experiencing shocks, and for this panel survivors sample, we found that there were some shocks that were more common in 2023 on the farm, but for the most part, losses due to drought, drops in prices, impacts on yield, delayed planting were abnormally high, at least in 2020 compared to 2023, where we saw real drops in the frequency of people experiencing those kinds of things. On the household side, however, we don't see a whole lot of variability through time, and that speaks to the fact that the likelihood of getting married or retiring or losing your job or having a health crisis may be not a lot different through time, depending on volatility in the farm economy or the farm weather. However, we do see bumps where you might expect it over a pandemic, which is the higher incidence of having a health crisis or having a friend or family member die over the previous 3 years. We did do a whole bunch of scaling of well-being, and we had a battery of questions about the sources of stress and how stressed out are you by a number of things. I showed you some of those results, and we found that it gave us a pretty interesting scale that behaves well as an index. And these are the actual values by the index. It goes between 0 and 68, I think. In 2020, when you put 2023 on there, you'll find that there's fewer people in those low middle categories and more people in the highest and lowest category, although the average score on stress and the levels of stress ticks down somewhat, not probably meaningfully. And again, these are matched individuals, the same pool of people in 2020 and 2023. We used an indicator of mental health that's often used in some of this literature called the K6 psychological distress. So you have stress and distress. The K6, and I'm not a psychologist or an expert in mental health, but as I read it, is classified into different kind of bins. And you have people who are experiencing certain things at some frequency that put them at very low levels of distress. But then if you score across all 6 items at a high rate, you get into clinically significant and meaningful psychological and mental health distress. And in the population as a whole, in 2020, we only had about 4% of the farms in our sample in that severe category who are at levels where you would have significant clinical concern, although the moderate category was not trivial. What was interesting to me, given that the shocks for the most part were unchanged or went down on the farm side and most of the household side, is that the level of psychological distress in 23 ticked up. Again, not probably in a statistically, I haven't even done the statistics on this yet, but dramatic, even if it's significant, it's not a dramatic, but going from about 35% to about 40% in the moderate and severe is a new finding for us, and we're kind of interested in understanding better why there might be more distress in 2023 than there was coming out of what were considered to be very painful years in 2018 and 2019. And that's what I got for you, and I did it on time, which I'm proud of. Happy to take questions.
Great job, Doug. Great job. As we are switching out slide decks, any question, you could, of course, always feel free to put questions for Doug in the chat, but if you have a question now, you can feel free to unmute yourself quickly, and then we can have Doug answer as Susanna puts up her slides.
While she's putting her slides up, I'll just say one more thing, and I didn't speak to it, but both of the surveys were done with kind of opportunistic funding in-house, resources we had access to. We've tried a couple of times to pursue long-term funding for a panel study using USDA NIFA funding, and haven't been successful. But as LJ said, if we can organize things where we do more of a regional project and we replicate and duplicate the effort across multiple states, I actually think the time is ripe for us to better understand these issues at a larger footprint level. And so if that is an interest of any of you out there, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, I would second that, and definitely reach out to Doug or myself or LJ. You have somebody who has their hand up. If you could go ahead and say your question. Is it see you? Okay.
Somewhat funny presenting. Please.
Oh, sorry, we can't hear you very well. You're cutting in and out. If you don't mind, can you just put the question in the chat?
Okay.
And I'm sure Doug will be able to answer.
All right. Okay. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead, Susanna.
Right. Thank you very much for the opportunity to introduce our NCR-Stat household data set and our work that is related to this data set. In my presentation that I divided into two parts, I will introduce our NCR-Stat household data set, and then will tell you a few words about the study that where we use data from our first data set, baseline survey 2022. So what is NCR-Stat? The North Central Region data set, the short is NCR-Stat, is what we are talking about, and include primary economic and social household data that we collected on the state level across North Central Region. And this data set focuses, or all data sets focus on households, businesses, and community well-being, both in rural and urban communities in the North Central Region. So far we have had two data sets. The first one was conducted in 2022, which is the baseline survey that I mentioned. And the second one is the caregiving survey that Maria mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. We published this data yesterday. Wow. So they are available for you to be downloaded for free, and we will dedicate the webinar in February to give you more information about this caregiving survey. So, about the purpose of NCR-Stat, there are more purposes of these data sets. In general, the NCR-CRD developed these data sets to decrease the barriers institutions face studying changes and trends in the North Central region, and to encourage collaboration across states and disciplines. It also corresponds with the three topical areas of NCR-CRD, which is creating resilient communities and economies, develop leadership and civic engagement, and promote community health and wellness. As for our baseline survey 2022, it was designed as a 15-minute Qualtrics online household survey that includes a lot of topics, as you can see, a little bit of everything. And it provides us with, or it gives us a lot of data to obtain a very good picture about North Central region. So the main 5 topics are household demographics, resilient communities and economics, leadership and civic engagement, community health and wellness, and we also included a couple of questions about environment. We defined 3 quotas to specify our sample. We cared about the share of non-family and family households. We distinguished between rural and urban households, and also we specified our sample based on the race and ethnicity quotas. For those who are interested how we defined rural areas, we considered rural areas as open and or sparsely populated countryside or town of less than 2,500 inhabitants. So respondents were asked where is their household located, and those questions told us, or the responses told us where they live, whether it's rural or urban area. The Qualtrics company that conducted the survey uses a different definition. They simply ask whether or the respondents to describe their residential location, whether it's suburban, urban, or rural. Here is rural defined as open or sparsely populated countryside, not within community distance to urban or suburban area. As I mentioned, our survey or our data were collected by the Qualtrics company that we employed, and they gathered the data based on the predefined quotas and used 2 different methods. The first one was online survey, where they used their online panel. Unfortunately, we couldn't, or they couldn't apply this method in all states to provide us with our required sample size per state, which was 417 households. They could employ this online survey only in 9 states in the North Central region, and in 3 states which are very rural with low population density. They had to employ a different strategy, which is computer-assisted telephone interviewing, so-called CATI, which is much more expensive. So our sample there was much lower, about 100 households or householders per state. Those states were Nebraska and North Dakota and South Dakota. So the final sample included the responses from soft launch consists of 4,668 households. Here is the distribution of respondents by state. You can see the three CAT states, Dakotas and Nebraska, and then the rest of the region. What we do with the data, we wrote and created a lot of data snapshots using descriptive statistics of variables included in the survey on the state level and NCR level, means regional level. And we also started writing research briefs, like more developed research papers. And all of these outcomes are published on our NCRCRD website as a story behind the numbers series. You can download for free our data at the Purdue University Research Repository, and you can get into the data sets through our website in the part dedicated to data resources. So you can push the purple button and it takes you directly to the Purdue repository, again, where you can download the data. And this was the last slide related to our introduction to NCR-Stat baseline survey. And now I will tell you a few words about the study that includes all data and variables that are part of the baseline survey 2022. So this study examines the impacts of health, spatial, and demographic aspects on the subjective well-being of households in two types of rural places in the North Central region. So as for the health disparities, it's well known that there are disparities, health disparities among rural and urban communities and rural communities themselves. And especially rural communities face a lot of health challenges, such as access to health resources, worse mental health status, and high number of mental disorders, substance use disorders, and many other challenges. As we included the spatial aspects into our study, I mentioned geographical location in this from this perspective, or at this point, geographical location in terms of rural areas means a lot of positives and also a lot of negatives. Rural areas may suffer with limited employment and economic development opportunities, deprivation and extensive isolation and community attachment. On the other side, there are a lot of beautiful places with very nice amenities or very strong community attachment. We also included into our study demographic characteristics, and it's again known that rural residents are often older, have lower educational attainment, and lower income. To measure subjective well-being, we use happiness as a variable that was included in the baseline survey, which is the self-reported happiness, and we used it as a proxy for subjective well-being. We measured the subjective well-being in two types of rural communities, rural areas as open in or sparsely populated countryside, and towns with up to 10,000 inhabitants. So you can see that we a little bit revised the definition of rural areas for the purposes of this study, just to increase the number of respondents. The economics of happiness guided our study, and in terms of well-being, we distinguish based on the literature between objective and other types of well-being. Obviously, objective well-being is measured by income and employment. The other well-beings are defined differently, and we focused on subjective well-being that includes happiness. That is our main or dependent variable. Talking about or speaking about the spatial aspect, we included space and place as a geographical aspect of economics of happiness. That includes a couple of effects: place-based effect, people-based effect, and contextual effect. The last one we have here only from the theoretical perspective, and we didn't consider it in our study. The place-based effect is the extent to which spatial factors determine the quality of life in the place of residence, and people-based effect is place-specific difference in the composition of the population. So adding this spatial dimension to the economics of happiness allows us to consider and analyze happiness and well-being depending on the place where people live. We used OLS regression analysis to determine the effect of household location, self-reported health status, and health indicators on self-reported happiness while controlling for the demographic characteristics of the respondents. We ran two models based on the household residential location. In the first model, we included households located in rural areas. In model 2, we involved households living in rural towns. And you can see that our dependent variable self-reported happiness was the question, taking all things together, how happy would you say you are, measured on a 1 to 10 scale. The independent variables included two groups of variables, health-related variables and then demographic characteristics. And I will jump directly to the results just to save time and to show you what we got. You can see then in rural areas and in rural towns, the health variables that significantly influence the subjective well-being or happiness are the same, which means that health status or self-reported health status, let's say the worst health status reported by the respondents, the less happy these respondents are. The opposite direction is in terms of substance use disorder awareness. Respondents who are aware or who know that their community implement community-based program reducing or preventing substance use disorder reported being happier. And not surprisingly, people who are depressed or anxious reported or depression and anxiety significantly negatively affect the subjective well-being. There is a difference between rural areas and rural towns because anxious or anxiety in rural areas is significant for the subjective well-being when the respondents report in being anxious several days and often during the last 3 months. there is a big difference between demographic characteristics or variables. We can see the marital status is the same or is a significant variable in both areas. It says that people who are divorced, separated, or not married are significantly less happy than those who are married, showing that or emphasizing the importance of family ties. In case of rural towns, we have number of different demographic characteristics that are significant. Respondents with higher income are happier than those with lower income. Respondents who reported a higher educational attainment are less happy than those with lower educational attainment. In line with literature, or literature says that these people might thrive better in cities that which provide more employment opportunities and advantages. Also, we can see that older people are significantly happier, and people indicating being white are less happy than others. So, to conclude, our findings imply that health-related factors, specifically self-reported health status, substance use awareness, and mental illnesses, significantly affect happiness in both examined rural locations. But at the same time, our results suggest that demographic drivers of subjective well-being in rural areas and rural towns may differ. In terms of place-based effect, we can see that remoteness and social isolation of rural areas may be associated with higher level of anxiety that might lead to a lower level of subjective well-being. And people-based effect means in our study that highly educated people in rural towns may be less happy because of limited employment opportunities, and older people in rural towns might be happier because of closer social ties. So I need to emphasize that those results are preliminary, but this is an example how we can how we use our data from the baseline survey 2022. And I think this is my last slide. So I stop sharing.
Thank you, Susanna. Any questions for, in the 2 minutes we have, for any of the speakers that have given us such interesting information and examples of data that we have across the region, and hopefully this will lead to further collaboration across state lines. I see that there was a lot of stuff in the chat, so I'm really hoping for that. Would anybody like to put another question in the chat, or unmute yourself quickly to ask a question, or raise your hand to ask a question? Well, while we're waiting for you, we're waiting to get off, I do want to say that LJ talked about some education questions that was one of the, I can't remember what year it was of this Nebraska poll. We did ask some education questions about the usefulness and economic viability of people's education in the caregiving survey. So if you're interested in some of that, there are some in the some of the surveys that we're doing right now. Okay, great. I don't see anybody like raising their hand, so I hope you found this useful, and this will lead to further collaboration across the region on all of these different rural and farm polls. And I look forward to seeing everybody at our February 27th webinar. With that, thank you so much.